A flurry of reactionary bills have just become law. And ahead of the local elections on Thursday, here are 3 ways the Tories have made Britain a more dangerous and less free place. At the top of the list is Priti Patel's Nationality and Borders Act. It's her attempt to take Britain's hostile environment and just ramp it up a notch. So what are the key points? Well, the Act introduces a new criminal offence for arriving in the UK without entry clearance. It introduces a 2-tier asylum system, meaning those who arrive in the UK via irregular means may receive less protection and support. And it reduces the threshold at which someone is considered to have committed a particularly serious crime and therefore may not receive refugee protection. These are all policies to try and make our asylum system even harsher than it already is. And the most contentious element is that first one. That's because it's contrary to international law to criminalise asylum seekers based on the means by which they arrive in a country. People have a right to seek asylum wherever they choose, regardless of how they get there. And by creating this new category of illegal asylum seekers, the government has given itself an excuse to shirk responsibility for people fleeing persecution. That's because, for most people, it's impossible to arrive in the UK except by irregular means. If you are an Iraqi, Sudanese, Iranian or Eritrean, the only way to claim asylum is to come to the UK. But if you do that, you will have broken the law and weakened your claim for asylum. It's a grim catch-22. But it gets worse. Because if an asylum seeker does come to Britain via an irregular route, which I repeat is for most people the only possible way to claim asylum here, they could find themselves with a one-way ticket to Rwanda. Yes, the government are planning to ship asylum seekers fleeing persecution 4,000 miles to Rwanda. This has been described as offshore processing. But the word processing here is a misnomer. If you get shipped to Rwanda and your asylum claim is accepted, you'll be given asylum to stay in Rwanda. Under no circumstances will you be able to come back to the UK. Other key parts of the Act make it harder to successfully claim asylum regardless of how you arrive in the UK. That's because it increases the burden of proof required and shortens the time that an asylum seeker has to show their evidence. And given there aren't many people fleeing war or persecution with reams of documents, this is just another transparent attempt to make our asylum system less humane. The Nationality and Borders Act was at the top of Priti Patel's agenda as Home Secretary, but this isn't the only sinister triumph she's had this year. That's because she's managed to get another set of laws through Parliament, the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act. The main aim of this law is to put a stop to the kind of recent protests that have been effective at holding the government to account on issues such as climate change and racism, but it will also have serious effects on Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. Here are the key changes. So the Act bans protests that cause, quote, serious disruption, increases the criminal penalties for breaking police conditions on protests, and makes trespass a criminal offence. Under laws contained in the Act, police have been given new powers to shut down protests that cause, as I say, quote, serious disruption. And what counts as serious disruption is decided by Priti Patel, by the Home Secretary. And it could mean anything from being too noisy to involving too many people. And if people don't acquiesce to police instructions to end the protest, they now face fines and criminal convictions. And it even applies to just a single person. Hold a placard and yell through a megaphone. And if you refuse to follow police directions about how to conduct your protest, you could be fined £2,500. The law also targets specific actions with lengthy prison sentences. The law means you can be jailed for up to 10 years for creating a public nuisance. And if you obstruct a motorway or an A road, you can get 1 year inside. Notably, the law also states that damage to memorials could lead to up to 10 years in prison, which could have applied to those who toppled the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. The law also asserts, and this is really sinister, that you can be guilty of not following police conditions on a protest, even if you didn't know they existed. Up to now, the police have to show that they told you before you didn't follow their instructions. Finally, by criminalising trespass, the Act makes it illegal for nomadic Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities to practice their traditional way of life. Nomadic GRT folk who move from place to place, stopping overnight or for a few days at a time, now run the risk of jail and a £3,000 fine if they stop on someone else's property. Worse, they can have their vehicle, so their caravan or camper van, compounded, leaving them homeless, which could risk their children being taken into care. The bill instead requires gypsies, Roma and travellers to settle on legal council-provided pitches. But, and here's the clincher, the Tories have already removed the obligation for councils to provide approved pitching sites. Many have since sold them off, and research in 2021 found that 1,696 families were on a waiting list for one of the few precious pitches available in the country. Finally, let's talk about the Elections Act. This has been spearheaded by Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch, and the government says the point of the act is to stop electoral fraud. These are the key elements. It requires voters to provide specific forms of photographic evidence at polling stations, increases government control of the Electoral Commission, and removes the 15-year limit on voters living overseas. It used to be the case that if you wanted to vote, you put yourself on the electoral roll and then simply turned up at your polling station on the day. Not anymore. Under the Elections Act, you will have to provide photographic evidence identifying yourself. These include passports and driving licenses, but older people can also use certain travel documents like the older person's bus pass, the disabled person's bus pass, the Oyster 60 Plus card, and the Freedom Pass. The Lords tried to amend the bill to include similar documents for younger people, national rail cards, for example, student ID cards, and 18-plus student Oyster cards, but the government rejected all of them. And it's also known that ethnic minorities are less likely to return to a polling station if turned away, and that poorer people don't have photographic ID to the same degree that wealthier people do. In 2021, Channel 4 looked into the issue.
This is something that's out there, that 1 in 4 Black and Asian people are not even registered to vote. So why are you now putting an extra challenge for this community who already doesn't vote? It's unacceptable.
Channel 4 News commissioned a special ethnic minority poll to get a glimpse into how these reforms could affect voter behaviour. We asked a crucial question. How likely would you be to return to the polling booth if you turned up to vote without the correct ID? Across all ethnic minorities, at least 1 in 4 said they were certain or unlikely to return. For the mixed group, that's higher at 34%. And for ethnic minorities who say they don't vote or they rarely vote, the number was even higher. 44% of people said they were unlikely to return.
13% of people in council housing, 11% of the unemployed, and 8% of disabled people don't currently have the correct ID.
As if that's not bad enough, the government has also helped itself to new powers to determine how elections are run. Until the law came in, the Electoral Commission was a wholly independent body charged with overseeing elections and prosecuting parties or individuals who broke their regulations. Not anymore. Now, the Electoral Commission must abide by a strategy and policy statement drawn up by the government that tells the Commission what its work and priorities should be. When the bill was first put forward, the Electoral Commission said this: the introduction of a strategy and policy statement which enables the government to set the strategic direction for the work of the Commission is not consistent with the role that an independent commission plays in a healthy democracy. This independence is fundamental to maintaining confidence in our electoral system. The provisions in the bill would give current or future UK governments the power to direct our work and may lead the public and campaigners to believe there had been political interference in the way we operate. This could affect the way we work to ensure parties and campaigners are following the political finance laws. It could also affect the advice and guidance we provide to electoral administrators, parties and campaigners and the UK's Parliament. Now, the government ignored this risk, evidently. Why, though? Most likely because they don't see it as a bug, but a feature. Finally, the new act changes the limit on how long you can live overseas while still being allowed to vote. Previously, if you lived abroad for 15 years or longer, you could no longer vote in UK elections. But now you can live overseas forever and still get a vote. And perhaps most importantly for the Tories, you can continue to donate to political parties, like this man did in 2019. John Gore is a theatre impresario who lives in the Bahamas. In 2019, the billionaire was the Tory party's largest donor, handing over £1 million in the weeks before the election. That brought his total donation to the party to 4.8 million since 2017. The Election Act evidently lets more people like Mr. Gore donate more money to the Tory party for longer, while making it harder for people who might not vote for the Tory party to vote.
The party of the small state, so-called, in fact uses the state aggressively. That, I think, is the lesson here, to fight class conflicts. And it shrinks only the state's softer redistributive arms. They disempower their opposition with an election meddling bill and an anti-protest law. And then they turn to the question how to generate popular support for the status quo while people face deep crises as their living standards plummet. And horribly, their answer is to direct as much popular rage as they can against the most vulnerable. So they say, okay, let's assault and harass travelers until their lives become unlivable. Maybe there's a few votes in that. They cleanse the country of refugees so that the same politicians who vote to bomb faraway lands and then sometimes profit by investing in soaring weapons stocks hope to keep their jobs by ensuring the people fleeing their bombs cannot reach safety. They hope their constituents will vote for them after they've pocketed some money and bombed people far away by keeping away desperate refugees. I mean, just imagine yourself in this position. Your home's destroyed, your life goes up in flames, you run into the sea because there seems to be no other option. And then Britain sends you to a land, Rwanda, which until 5 minutes ago, the British government itself said does not respect human rights, a country where refugees were shot by the police for protesting against cuts to their food rations. Nobody is safe from this political logic, which attacks one vulnerable group after another. LGBT people were once thought accepted and safe in British society when I was growing up under New Labour. Now we see renewed attacks on trans people. Just this week, it was revealed that children are being surveilled by Home Office employees still positioned in local councils to spy on family services in order to stop immigrants using them and possibly to deport immigrants. That's the no recourse to public funds policy. So think what that means. Kids facing abuse are told not to seek help, or the state will put people into councils to chase them down and punish them. It's really, really sickening. And we face 10 years now of social sadism targeting one group after another. You might think you're safe from this if you're white. But remember, in the early Cameron Osborne years, the attacks, vicious kind of moral panic attacks on anyone claiming any kinds of benefits, even though lots of people claiming benefits are in work, but they were called lazy and work shy, while bankers profited enormously. You might think if you're in a stable job, then you're safe from these kind of nasty attacks. But remember, in those early Cameron Osborne years, the attacks on public sector workers with their gold-plated pensions. The politics of moral panics and setting victims against each other only benefits a tiny ruling class. And the worrying thing here is the fusion of that politics of moral panic in an attempt to gain support for a Tory party which doesn't have answers to the desperate crises of our moment. The fusion of those moral panics against one group after another, Roma people, migrants, with an authoritarianism that seeks to clamp down on opposition, to use the state aggressively in the name of a politics that claims to be all about libertarianism and a small state. It's very worrying times.
It's also just incredibly transparent on loads of levels. I mean, obviously they're trying to sort of do a populist appeal to what they think is a reactionary base, but especially when it comes to the police and crime bill, it's so obvious that what they are doing is to try and make sure that the quite successful movements, which we've seen over the past few years, can't happen again. What have been the most successful protests over the past few years that really transformed the public debate and had an effect on policy? It was Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020 and the pulling down of the Colston statue, which, you know, I think if you poll the public, everyone said, oh, I like the cause, but I don't like how they did it. But people who were brought onto a jury, you know, to think about this seriously, they found those people innocent of criminal damage because essentially they recognized that pulling that statue down was the right thing to do. You know, what the Tories will say is, oh yeah, of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to bring down a statue of a slave trader, but you should do it by the proper means. The reason they pulled that down is because it was impossible to bring it down by the proper means. Once they pulled it down, then that completely transformed the politics of all of this. Colston Hall was renamed. There were schools which were renamed. This idea that it was acceptable to have large parts of Bristol, a city with a large black population, named after a slave trader, that was transformed overnight because of that very, very effective piece of direct action. And it's just not the case that if we threaten people with 10 years for pulling down a statue, people will find other means to take that down. Because the history of the Colston statue in Bristol, shows that people had tried all the means. People had tried all the legitimate means, all the lawful means. They resorted to that, and and it worked. As I say, if you poll people to say, oh, I don't like that it was brought down, but they all agree with the cause, so this action works. Sometimes you need to do it. Extinction Rebellion, exactly the same. If you look at polling on how much people cared about climate change, the moment that first wave happened, when they were sort of occupying those bridges, the number of people who put climate change as one of their top 3 concerns rocketed. It was unprecedented. And that had real practical impacts. Parliament declared a climate emergency. They would not have done that without people causing unrest, causing a public nuisance in the middle of London. I understand how people, they're trying to get their bus to work. They're kind of annoyed, potentially, that the bridge is being blocked. But if we make all of these things illegal, then how are these changes going to happen? Because as I say, if they hadn't pulled down that statue, well, who knows? It could have been there for another century. I mean, they had been trying to bring it down by the legitimate means. It didn't work. And now what this law does is essentially means that there are fewer and fewer ways for people to fight for justice and to get rid of offensive statues and change catastrophic policies such as Britain's relationship to fossil fuels at the moment. Barnaby, how do you think this will affect protests? I mean, on one level, the Extinction Rebellion argument was always, we want to go to prison because it's only by going to prison that we show how serious this issue is. Do you think they will sort of continue despite the laws and just take the punishment? Or do you think this really will scare people away from going out and taking part in disruptive protests?
Well, it's very important that we don't do the government's work for it by scaremongering about the law in a way that puts people off the streets. So it's not the case that a law has been passed which bans all protest and which means that no one should ever protest again. And that there's been some concern from various organizers in different campaigns about presentations of the law like that. But one of the things that governments do when they pass laws is trump them up with a grand rhetoric that exaggerates what they're doing and so hopes to put people off protesting. I don't think it will put people off protesting, but it will ensure that lots of direct action and even just noisy and troublesome protests, people on picket lines, for example, lots of trade unions in recent years. Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, has pioneered a strategy of targeted, loud, active, colourful protest against bad employers, for example. And so all of those possibilities are going to be narrowed. And when organizations like trade unions or big NGOs are thinking of calling protests, they'll have to consult lots of lawyers about what they can and can't do. And their ability to act freely will be chilled. And individuals who are not part of those big groups who don't know about these things, who go out and protest, can then be taken out of action with big fines that stop them from being able to protest again. And so I think it's worrying. It's not the case that all protest is going to be impossible now, but it is part of a government that claims to love liberty and hate the big oppressive state. Boris Johnson likes to talk about how the Labour Party is the party of oppressive state power. In fact, yet again, as has always been the case, the ruling class uses the state to fight its wars and is prepared to, and that means abroad, and it also means at home against the oppressed and exploited. And they're doing it now.
I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding of this law is that it might actually take a while for us to understand its significance, because one of the things it does is just introduces a lot of discretionary powers. So introduces discretionary power for the police and for the Home Secretary to define when something is a public nuisance. The law does give the police and the Home Secretary the kind of powers that really could ban a very, very wide range of protests, but we don't know how it's going to be enforced. And, as Barnaby says, it's not that protests are banned, but essentially the government now has a lot more power to ban protests than it did previously. And these are rights which we've had for centuries. Like, it is a pretty big deal, especially that trespass one. I always remember in my more anarcho days, people always talk, trespass is not illegal. It's never been illegal in Britain. I always thought of that as sort of this foundational thing about sort of British liberalism. Just gone, just gone. It's illegal now. You can't do it anymore. They've passed this so easily. I thought lots of these were sort of ancient rights that actually it would be kind of hard to take away, but they've just written them all down. Oh, actually, the Home Secretary can decide if this is illegal. The Home Secretary can decide if that's illegal. And that's now the law.